Hi, welcome to this next lesson in our series on using models in ASP.NET MVC. We've already looked at how to create a model class to represent data inside of our application and to work with that in a controller and pass it into the view. Today we're going to go a little bit deeper and talk about two additional concepts. The first is that of a view model, and a view model is going to be a special model class that we create that will allow us to kind of bundle up related data that is associated with a view. And it's also going to enable our second topic, which is validation. It will make validation relatively seamless, and we'll see that we have some nice tools within ASP.NET MVC to reduce the amount of validation code that we have to write. So first, before we look at the code, let's talk about what a view model is. I think view models can be a little bit tricky to wrap your brain around at first, so I want to just highlight a few high-level pictures of what we're going to do with them. And we'll also kind of iterate on this. We'll start out with some simple examples. We'll make up some more complex examples, and we'll also kind of review at the end of this what a view model is, and we'll come back to it a few times to make sure that you're exposed to the concepts again and again. A view model is a model class to be specifically used in a view. So we will typically have associated with a view within our application, a ViewModel class. So if you think about the CheeseMVC application, we had the Cheese model, and that wasn't in any way built to be tied to a specific view. In fact, we could use that model class in a lot of different views. And in fact, it was actually explicitly intended to not be tied to the way that our application and our views and controllers were structured. A ViewModel class is the opposite. It's a model class that will be intimately tied to the way that our controllers and views work, and in fact will enable some stronger coding in that arena. They will allow our views to be strongly typed, and this means that when we're working within a view template, if we're using a view model, we will be less likely to make mistakes. We'll have some compile time checking. In other words, the Visual Studio compiler will be able to check things for us, so we're not able to accidentally mistype the name of a property or something like that, which was definitely possible when we were using the view bag or the view data objects. And view models are also really great for doing form validation, and form validation, as you'll see, is going to be a lot easier than what we've seen in previous web applications, in particular in the Python web applications in Unit 2, where we had to write a lot of form validation code. We'll really have to write very minimal validation code within our view model classes. Okay, so let's go ahead and bounce back over to Visual Studio and pick up our application that we've been working on in this series of lessons. So here I am back in CheeseMVC, and this is exactly where we left off from the last lesson. And I'm going to go to our controller. And the first thing I want to do is give you an example, one of the most basic examples that we can come up with of using a view model in a controller and a view. And in fact, this one is basic enough that we don't even need to create a new class for it. Okay, so here I have in my index action, recall that the index action just displays a list of all of the cheese records in our data store in our application. And it does that by passing the list of cheeses into the view bag, or via the view bag, right? We said viewbag.cheeses equals cheesedata.getAll. And recall that if we use the view data object, that these were basically interchangeable, just they had different syntax, I could do something like this, right? And this would be equivalent to the line above. Okay, so those are two ways that we've seen that we can pass data into the view. However, as I mentioned before, there are a couple of issues with this. Let's look at our template, and I'll show you the primary issue. If I'm in my view here, I have to manually pull out that cheeses object by name by referring to .cheeses off the ViewBag class. If I accidentally come in here and misspell it, I'm not going to know until I actually run my application. Okay, there's no checking of this, right? So the application will only try to pull out this CHEESS thing from the view bag when the application is actually run, which is too late for me to really fix it, right? So it would be nice if the compiler could warn us about things like this. Secondly, there aren't any real enforcement activities going on around the types of data that we're using. Okay, so essentially we could write, when we're looking at things that we're getting out of the view bag, we can write really bad code accidentally or intentionally and not really know it until our application is run, in which case the user is going to be receiving those errors as opposed to us. Okay, so let's go back to the controller and let's see how we can modify this to use a view model to eliminate those issues. Instead of using the view bag to pass in data to the view, I'm going to pass data into the view directly. So let me delete this. So we only have this guy right here, and I'm going to go ahead and say that instead of putting the cheeses in the view bag, let me just make a variable here, a local variable to represent all of the cheeses. And is that what we get back? List of cheeses. Oh, I guess I need to add the using statement. Okay, there we go. So now we have our cheeses stored in this local variable. I can pass this object into the view by giving it to the view method here that's in the last statement that we've been kind of used to using without any arguments. We can also pass a single object into that view method, and this will make that object available directly to the view. So let's go back to the view and see how we might use it. Now within the view, when we want to use a view model, we need to declare so at the top of our view template. And the way we do that is by using the @model syntax. Notice that that's @lowercase model. And then here I need to specifically list the type of thing that I want to use. And here we don't have using statements, so we have to list the fully qualified type of the thing we're using. So just to reiterate, the item that I'm passing into the view is of type list cheese. So it's a list of cheese objects. When I'm in my view, I say that my model will be of type list cheese. And again, this extra syntax is simply because we can't have using statements within our view template. Within our controller, we have this using statement up here, which means that we don't have to preface every reference to the cheese class with the fully qualified type name. In the template though, we will need to do that. Okay, so then rather than using the view bag, I can then get my cheeses object off of the model. So instead of saying viewbag.cheeses, I can say model. And notice here, this is kind of a gotcha when you first start doing this. This model has a capital M. All right, the declaration of the model at the top has a lowercase m. Okay, so here, this model will refer to the thing of this type that was passed into the view. In other words, it's going to refer to the view model. Now let's go down below and look at how we can refactor the rest of our template to use the model. So here again, I'm getting viewbag.cheeses. That is simply the model. And then here, these should work just the same way because that's the name of the iterator variable is cheese. Remember, the model will be a list of cheeses, so this iteration, this for each iteration, will happen in the same way that it happened before, only I'll be getting it out of the model rather than the view bag. Okay? And that looks all good. Let's go ahead and save and run. And recall, the net effect of the code that we just changed is that the user shouldn't see any changes. This was what we call a refactor. We improved the behavior of our program without changing the functionality. So we just want to test, once this loads, that things still work as they did before. In particular, the main action, the index action, should still display a list of cheeses the way it's done always. Okay, let me add one to see how this works. Okay, and that indeed worked the same way it did before. So our changes were all good. I'm going to come back and stop my server. So just to reiterate, we were able to use this model object directly in the view because we declared a model at the top and we passed in that model via the view method. And so this is an example of a view model. In this case, we didn't have to create a special class for it. We could just use this particular object that we were working with. Much of the time, though, once we have something that's a little bit more complex, we're going to create entire classes to represent a view model. So let's go ahead and look at what that might look like. One of the most common cases that you'll see with view models is to use them to represent forms. Okay, and so here we have a form that has two actions associated with it: add up here, and then this new cheese that corresponds to the post action. I'm going to go ahead and refactor this before. When we've been sitting on this, this is probably not the best way to name this. We did it in one of the first lessons to illustrate how we could customize routes. But in this case, I can actually just delete that route and have the same net functionality by making that add. Okay, in this case, the MVC routing engine will determine that this is the correct method to receive a post request because of the post attribute and because it will be receiving data that corresponds to a cheese object. Okay, so these two methods, the add that will correspond to a get request, which displays the add cheese form, and the add action that corresponds to a post request that actually creates the new object and adds it to our data store. We want to refactor these to use a view model. Okay, so let's go ahead and see what that might look like. View models are best stored in a different directory than your models. So we'll come over here and we'll make a new directory at the top level of our project. And I'm going to call this ViewModels. Okay, and then within this, I'm going to create my first ViewModel class. And the name of this class, the name of your ViewModel classes should correspond to what the view is doing that they're associated with. So this is going to be on the view that adds new cheeses. So I'm going to say this is the add cheese view model. It's also a common practice to put the view model, just that word, those two words, in each of the class names for your ViewModel classes. Okay, and then we get this empty class here. And so this view model, the purpose of it is going to be to represent all of the data that is associated with the add view, and that is on both sides of that view, the displaying of the form and the processing of the form. So if we think about what that view is doing on both sides, that will guide us in terms of determining what properties our add cheese view model should have. Okay, so if we think about let's think about the processing of the form first, right? So in the processing of the form, we're going to need to basically gather multiple types of information. We want to process the form by creating a new cheese object, and so I'm going to want to have a name and a description. I expect to receive these each from my form. Okay. And so let's go ahead and see how we can then use this view model within both of our views here, just as simple as it is already. So within the add view, I'm going to go ahead, or the add action rather, I'm going to go ahead and make a new instance of my view model. And I tend to make fairly verbose names here. Make sure then, right there, I just want to iterate that we, when I right-clicked, I had to go all the way down to the using. Make sure that you're selecting the right item from that IntelliSense menu, as they call it, the little helper menus that are in Visual Studio. In this case, sometimes it'll pop up the first action or two in that menu will not be the one you want. But I wanted to add a using statement corresponding to that new class. Okay, and then I can pass this in to my view. And now, when we look at this, it doesn't seem that this is going to be that helpful for us in rendering the form, right? We already have a form that's rendered. Why is passing this view model in going to help us? Well, it turns out that we can actually improve the way our form is rendered to make it more dependent and more tied to the data that we're actually looking at. Okay, so let's go ahead and now that we've passed in our view model to the view, let's look at our add form and see how we can update our add form to use the view model. The first thing I need to do is to actually declare the model. And remember that we have to use the fully qualified class name. Okay. And now within my form, I can use some special tags to have much of the form generated based on the view model. Okay, so this is going to be very helpful, and we'll see that at the end of the day, once we get done with this refactoring, we'll have a lot less code in here, and the code will be a lot less error prone after we refactor it. Okay, so first I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here and show you a quick way just to kind of something that we've been using before, but that we can add in here to make our form declaration a little better. So recall that we've used the ASP controller attribute. All right, I can also use that on a form to specify the action that is associated with the form. In other words, the URL, the resource that the form should post to. So I want to specify that this should post to the cheese controller, and I can also say ASP action and say that it should post to the add method, the add action method. Okay, and so I do that partly because this is a little bit more explicit within our form. It tells the user or somebody reading our code exactly what this form will do, where it will post. But also, it introduces this new concept by looking at something we were already familiar with. We've used ASP controller and ASP action to generate links dynamically within our pages before. And these are examples of what are called tag helpers. Okay, and so a tag helper is something provided by the Razor engine that will help us generate some HTML that is tied to our ViewModel classes. So let's look at how we can help generate our labels and inputs using these tag helpers. So notice that for both of these sort of form groups, the pair of a label and an input here, I have a lot of redundant stuff, right? I'm generating the label with a given name, and that has to do with the name of the property on the object I want to create. The for equals uses name. I have name equals name, ID equals name. And a similar thing down here, a lot of repeated stuff. We can use these tag helpers to generate a label and an input that are based on the properties of our view model. So let's look at how we can do that. So I can say ASP-for, and notice when I did that, the way that these were highlighted went from a plain highlighting to a bold highlighting. That tells you that Visual Studio is recognizing this now as a tag helper, and I can use capital name, and I can get rid of the content of that label. So this tells Visual Studio, or it tells ASP.NET rather, that I want it to generate a label for the name property of the view model. Okay, and that name property is eventually going to correspond to the name property of a cheese. I can do the same thing down here. I can get rid of these three attributes entirely, and I can say ASP for name. And this will result in the rest of those fields being generated properly based on the name attribute and how that should be handled for us. Okay, let's do the same thing with description. And I'm going to make this a capital D because that's the name of the property. And I can get rid of all of these. Okay, that's great. And there we go. So notice that we have a lot less code here, and that the code is actually tied to the view model. The view model is going to help ASP.NET generate our label and input in a way that represents the data that our form expects to handle and to process on the back end. So now let's bounce back to the controller and look where we're going to handle that form input. So in this add action right here, where we receive the post, we've previously been getting a cheese object via model binding. Recall that based on the data fields within the form that was posted, this object would be created with those data fields populated. Rather than use a cheese object, I want to go ahead and refactor this to use a view model. And let me just actually use the same snippet there. So now, rather than receiving a cheese object, I want my add action to receive an add cheese view model object. And the same end result will happen, which is that the input that corresponds to the name attribute, or the name property rather, and the input that corresponds to the description property of our view model will be populated by the values from the form when they are received, when this view model is received here in our controller, okay? And so why would we want to do this? Well, one good reason is that the view model is often going to contain more than just the fields that we correspond to properties in the object that we're creating, okay? And we'll see examples of that very soon. The other one is that this is going to allow us to add a layer of validation before we actually go ahead and create a new cheese object, okay? So I don't want to go to the work of creating a new cheese object if the data that the user gave me doesn't validate. So that's the first real hard case of this showing an improvement in our code that we're going to see. So let's go ahead and refactor this to first just use the view model. Okay. So I don't have a cheese object yet. Notice I have my red error message here. Let's go ahead and create one. I'm going to do that using this property initializer style of a constructor, where I use curly braces instead of parentheses. Okay, and I'm just going to set the name of the cheese to be the name of the view model, its name property, and the same with the description. So we're essentially using this view model object as a carrier for our data between the controller and the view on both sides of the add form. We're using it as a carrier on the front end and also on the back end. And again, the utility of this will become more and more apparent as we add functionality as we go. So we're at a good point where we should probably test our code. So go ahead and save and start up your server. Okay, and let's go ahead and add a cheese and see what we get. So when I go to this page, I expect that the code that I used to render the form was actually hit. Let's go ahead and use our inspector, your dev tools, to look at this form a little bit more closely. Recall that we changed the way this form was rendered. And so in particular, if I look at the form, I see that my input has an ID, it has a name, and it has a type. These are all things that I did not declare in my template. If we go back to look at our template, we just declared that the input should be for the name property of our view model, and that the label associated with it should be for the name property too. And so the framework went and created the right HTML attributes for us, okay? And so with both the name property and the description property, that was the case. So that's just one little bonus of using ViewModels. And then let's go ahead and create a new object. Okay, we see that the object was created in the same way that it was before, only this time it was using the view model essentially as the carrier between the controller and the view. Okay, so let's go ahead and stop our server, and let's see the first one of the additional real benefits of using a view model here in our application, and that is to add validation. Okay, so if I go to my view model, I have these two properties, and it would be nice to be able to add some level of validation so that, for example, somebody couldn't add a cheese without a name. And that turns out to be pretty easy to do. The first thing I need to do is to add an attribute to this property, and I'm going to use the required attribute. You'll need to include a new using statement. It's part of the system component model data annotations namespace. So just by adding this as required, that will give me the ability to validate this name property while it's coming into my controller. It won't automatically validate it. I'll have to do a little bit more work, but it will give me the ability to validate it. Okay, one more thing I want to show you while we're here is that you can customize the way that these view model properties are displayed in the view. One of the things I can do, for instance, is say display and give this a name that's different from the property name. And say its display name would be cheese name, something a little bit more explicit. Okay, and then we'll see this in a minute. The next time we run our server, I'll point out to you where this actually was used. Okay, so now in order to enable validation within our form handler, we need to come back to our add action. And I need to check that the view model is actually valid before I go ahead and create my new cheese. The way I do that is to use a conditional, and I say if model state is valid. Okay. And when I do this, this will check that the properties within the view model that is being passed into my action method here are actually valid according to the attributes that I've added. In particular, the one required attribute will be enforced if I say is model state valid, or if model state is valid. And then that's where I want to go ahead and put all of this code that I've written to actually create a new cheese object. If the model's not valid, I want to re-render the form. Okay, I want to send the user back to the form. The way I can do that is say return view. And now this is going to, we should pass this our view model as well. And this is basically the same thing we did, just to draw your attention back above. This is basically the same thing we did when we rendered the form in the first place, is we're passing in our view model. The only difference now is that our view model might actually contain data. Above, when we were rendering our form, the view model did not contain data. It just had empty properties. This time it might contain data, and in particular, it might have an error message. And we'll see how to render those error messages next. Okay, so just to reiterate, if the model state is valid, I'm going ahead and going to carry out all of the related behaviors that I wanted to do when I have valid data. If it's not, I'm going to reach this last line and pass the view model back into the view and re-render the form. Let's look at our form again and see how we can display our error messages. So within the form here, above my form inputs, I'm going to create a div, and I'm going to use the tag helper ASP validation summary. Okay, and this will allow me to display any error messages that might be coming into the view. And so by saying ASP validation summary all, this says that I want to display all error messages within that div that are associated with data for this particular form. So at this point, we can start our server and test out our validation. Okay, so let's go to our add cheese form. And now notice here the label associated with the first input says cheese name rather than just name. I said I would point that out to you. That is a result of us customizing the display name for this property back in the view model. Okay, so this is one way that you can think of view models. We said that models should be model objects like our model classes like our cheese class should be independent of the way the rest of our application works. things like this, adding validation, changing the way a field is displayed within a view, those are things that are highly dependent on the way our application works. Our model should be independent of that, okay? So that's one of the reasons why using view models can be advantageous. Now let's go ahead and just try to submit this without actually populating this field and see what happens. Okay, and so above we now have an error message. The cheese name field is required. All right, and that's because we did not fill it out and we submitted it and it had the required tag back here in the view model. Okay, if I go ahead and fill this out, it will go through just fine, even though I didn't enter a description. That's because the description is not listed as a required property. Okay, so that handled the basic validation. Let me show you a couple more things about validation here. Let's stop our application. And one thing you can do, here we've decided to display all the error messages that are associated with our view model in one spot. You can also put them in specific places. You can display them one at a time. So to do that, you would use a span, and you would use the ASP validation for helper, tag helper, and you would give it the property that you want to display the error message for. So in this case, we'll get an error message for the name property if one exists. Now let's do the same thing for description, because we'll add a description validation attribute in just 1 second. Notice that when I was doing this, I'm getting suggestions from Visual Studio. Typically, when we were using the ViewBag to pass data around, we weren't getting such suggestions. That's because by using a view model and by declaring a view model within our view templates, the compiler is able to determine what objects and what types of objects we are working with within our view template, and that becomes a strongly typed view, as they say, and also prevents us from making silly mistakes. Okay, so I added a place to have these. I'm going to go ahead and remove this, since each of the errors will be displayed next to the corresponding form element. If you have just a couple of form elements like we do here, displaying all the errors in one place is not such a bad idea. But as your forms become larger, if you think of a large form like a user registration form, or like the form you filled out to register for a LaunchCode class that has lots of inputs, you would probably want those error messages to be as close to the location of the error as possible. Let's come back over here and let's add the required attribute here. And let's add one more little piece of customization. You can specify what the error message is using this error message parameter. Okay, if you don't, you'll just get a very generic error message, but here you can specify the explicit error message that you might want to give. Okay, also note that there are some other types of validation attributes that you can use. I'll link to these on the course site. You can specify, if you have a numeric input, you can specify the valid number ranges that are associated with that, the minimum length or maximum length of strings, things like that. But here we just want to get comfortable with the machinery of using validation. The rest of them are pretty simple to apply once you're comfortable with that. Okay, let's make sure we've saved everything. And here we don't need to make any changes to our controller. Okay, here we are, and let's add a new cheese, and we're going to test out our new validation attributes here. Let's just try to submit it as an empty form, and we see now we get this inline message here with the specific custom error message that we specified for our description property and the generic error message that we specified for our name property. That's great. Let me just show you one more feature of the way these view models work. If I have one field that is valid and another field that isn't valid, when I submit that form, notice that it keeps the value of my valid. It keeps all the valid input values, basically, right? Which is a very user-friendly feature. So yet another reason to use view models with these tag helpers. And when I have valid input, it will be submitted just as we like. So let's go ahead and review our view model characteristics that we introduced at the beginning, just to summarize what we learned and why we find view models useful. So a view model we cite as a model class specifically used in a view, and in here, in the example we had here, we use the add cheese view model to basically provide some of the same properties that would go into our cheese model class, but to add on some validation properties and some other things. And we'll see in a future lesson ways we can make our view models even more complex, but it was a way for us to make a model class that is specifically meant to be used in a specific view, and to basically give our views a power boost in terms of rendering the right form fields and validating those form fields. They allowed our views to be strongly typed, so when we're writing our views, the compiler is going to give us some checking on the names of things and the types of those things that we're using, which we previously did not get when we used the view bag. And then finally, they were a convenient place for us to add form validation using some built-in MVC framework tools. So we went through a simple view model this time. In the next lesson, we'll go through a little bit more complex use case of a view model to show you how they can become even more powerful as you integrate them into your applications.